Monsieur le Président, c'est un grand honneur.
Mr. Speaker, it's a great honor to take the floor today and to have the honor to be the first speaker on this so very important issue. Allow me to recognize that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinabe people. To me, it's clear we're in an emergency situation, a climate emergency. I just took part in the 26th Conference of the Parties in Glasgow on the UN climate change plan. This is the 12th time I've taken part in that conference, and the situation is now more grave than it was first.
That the climate emergency is outpacing any government's actions to take control of the situation. And I want to address this issue cognizant of the time. And I do take my friend and colleague, the Honourable Member for Abbotsford's remarks earlier today, who also wanted an emergency debate, to heart. We want to focus on what's just happened in our home province of British Columbia. But there's a context here, and any action that we take now that ignores the root causes of what just happened invites worse to come, and we need to take account of root causes, and we need to take appropriate actions. So with your indulgence, Mr. Speaker, I will say that my intention here is to start with the global, move to the national, and then focus most of my remarks on the provincial and the local and what we do now. And I hope that we can approach this issue tonight, all of us members of Parliament from 5 different parties, in a way that reflects the best of us in recognizing that we have more in common than in the difference. I'm looking across the way right now, Mr. Speaker, to my friend from Mission Matsui Fraser Canyon, who referenced earlier today that it was in his riding that Lytton burned to the ground in 15 minutes earlier this summer. I don't think we can only look at the floods that just happened. We have a lot of events that have taken place and hit the same communities, the same First Nations communities, over and over again within the period of time in which this House was adjourned from towards the end of June until we just reconvened on Monday. We have to recognize that we are in a climate emergency, as this House did. Some of us were in our seats then, June 17th of 2019, on a motion from the former Minister of Environment, who's no longer in this place, so I can use her name, Catherine McKenna. This House voted that we were indeed in a climate emergency, and we had to take account of that. But nothing has changed. We don't act as though we are in an emergency. The
great scientific undertaking has done very clear research, and in October 2018, the report on the question of 1.5 degrees was undertaken, and the news is so terrible. We have to act immediately, as of back in October 2018. And now 30 months have gone by, and the situation, 3 years rather, have gone by, and the situation is even worse than in October 2018.
Climate change in their emergency report on 1.5 degrees, which is the target of the Paris Agreement, that we were in desperate risk of missing it. It's not a political target. The reason the IPCC was asked to produce the report that they produced was to inform policymakers, politicians, and government leaders around the world what's the difference between 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase and 1.5. And I won't go through all the details of the report. I can't in the time available. But as one of the government leaders, the Prime Minister of Barbados, just said a few days ago in Glasgow, 2 degrees Celsius is a death sentence for us. Only at 1.5 do we survive. What the IPCC sketched out was not that 1.5 makes us live in a safe world. but it's one we can survive. It allows coral reefs to survive mostly. It will protect our Arctic mostly, but not entirely. We will experience permafrost thaw, but it won't be a fatal level of permafrost thaw. Over and over again, that report, which is seminal, pointed out that 1.5 was essential. Then we had this summer the report of the first working group, its sixth assessment report of the IPCC, which was labeled by the Secretary General of the United Nations as Code Red for Humanity, because it said that everything they'd warned about in 2018 is happening faster with greater severity than they had anticipated. So we know globally that we are now on track to shooting well past 2 degrees, well past the danger zone. This is not about bad weather. This is about whether human civilization can survive. That's what we're talking about. No issue could be more riveting. The stakes could not be higher. And still, on a day-to-day basis, we have this ability to function as though there's still time. Sadly, tragically, the Government of Canada chose to use part of the IPCC advice. The part that said, if we hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius, by mid-century, 2050, we should be at net zero. I need to enforce this. I need to say it slowly, particularly for my Liberal colleagues, because I am not sure that the government understands the way in which this information is being manipulated by someone, somewhere. But the IPCC has never said the goal is net zero by 2050, and then we'll get through all this and human civilization will survive. They've said very clearly there's only one pathway to hold to 1.5 degrees, and it starts with at least 45% reductions globally, that's a lot, against 2010 levels by 2030. If we don't do that, net zero by 2050 is meaningless. It'll be too late. We will have taken a very significant step towards the unbearable risks of unstoppable, self-accelerating global warming triggered by, well, some people call them points of no return, tipping points. The important thing to say is we still have time. Le temps presse, mais ce n'est pas trop tard.
Time is urgent, but it's not too late. We must take immediate action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also to make the changes needed to protect nature, especially forests.
Barely enough time. And in COP26, we did not do what needed to be done. Not Canada, not anyone. I will say that, as the UN Secretary General said, COP26 wasn't a failure in that 1.5 degrees as a possible endpoint for the global warming nightmare is possible. But as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, it's on life support. That's where we are. So by 2022, and preferably before then, this country needs to do more. So at the national level, if we're serious about the climate emergency, and I know I risk being heckled, but it must be said, we can't be serious about the climate emergency while building the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We can't be serious about the climate emergency while subsidizing fracking and LNG and all of the fossil fuels. We must bring in a Just Transition Act. We must take care of workers. We must make this transition. So now, moving from global to national, we know we have a lot of work to do. And many of the measures that have been put forward by this government, I support. But in their totality, they are insufficient to ensure that my children alive today will be in a livable world when they are my age. And that is something that affects all of us deeply and personally. And I'm grateful we have a chance to talk about it. But when you talk about personal, let me shift to British Columbia. This climate emergency hit home really closely this summer. In British Columbia, the heat dome it was called, more than a heat wave, killed nearly 600 people in 4 days. One of those who was affected and didn't die is my stepdaughter, who's in her 30s, who happened to be at my husband's family's farm in Ashcroft, British Columbia, not far from Lytton, where the temperature at the farm hit 50 degrees Celsius. I don't think any of us here can really imagine what that's like. She said it was like having a hairdryer blowing on her face all the time outdoors. It hurt your skin. And she nearly died and had brain edema. Another family member was a first responder, pulling people out of shacks and trailers and putting them in ambulances and knowing they wouldn't live. We have to do a much better job when we talk about what do we do now, what have we learned? We need healthcare protocols that are radically revamped, that look at what do you do when you find someone whose organs are already cooking. It's not the protocol they were using in the summer in BC. We had wildfires from early April till the end of September. That wildfire season in British Columbia saw 1,600 wildfires destroying over 868,000 hectares. That also contributed to how bad the flooding damage was, because the ground had become hydrophobic. Hydrophobic meaning it expelled the water that fell on the ground. The ground could not absorb water, the ground repelled it. The flooding was worse because of the fires. And of course, the flooding was described as an atmospheric river. We learn new terms as we go through this. During the fire season, we learned that there were things called pyrocumulonimbus clouds. Those are clouds that shoot sparks that create more fires. We are not in a normal climate situation. We have entered the world of a climate emergency. And all of with this that we've experienced, and I should mention more, of course, the flooding, people know, destroyed highways, Coquihalla, when will it ever get repaired? I mean, the massive amounts of damage, 18 highways and 5 bridges significantly impacted by the flooding, the loss of life, the terrifying experience for people caught in mudslides, the horror of losing farms. I mentioned my husband's farm in Ashcroft, where now we have for the second time taken in climate refugees. In the summer, we took in people who were on wildfire alerts. Now they're people who've lost everything in the floods. This is unbearable, but there are things we can do. And we must be serious about doing them, and it's a national effort. We know that from the speech from the throne, there's finally a commitment. Well, I've heard it before, actually. I remember the previous Conservative government promised a national adaptation plan. The goal here is to act to reduce the damage of the climate emergency to the greatest extent possible by reducing our dependence on fossil fuels as quickly as possible, making transitions to renewable energy, and so on. But there's an impact that's baked into our atmosphere. There are levels of climate damage that we will not be able to avoid. So we have to avoid those levels of climate impact to which we cannot adapt, such as I mentioned, runaway global warming that would mean that we couldn't really survive on this planet as a species. And we have to adapt to those levels that we can no longer avoid. Adaptation involves a lot of elements. So yes, the ministers for public safety, public security, and infrastructure must be seized of this. This is a whole of government approach. I would urge the government of Canada consider and I very rarely urge the government of Canada to consider something that a U.S. administration is doing. But the U.S. president has appointed John Kerry, who was to be Secretary of State in the Obama administration, not as the head of his Environment Department, but as a key member of the National Security Committee inside the White House.
Because the President of the United States understands well that climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's about a threat to our national security, like a military threat at another time would have been.
National security threat that requires a whole-of-government approach. It's particularly important, I look at the member for Nunavut here, we have to think about what's happening in our Arctic. We have to think like a circumpolar country. We have to know that we have to keep the permafrost cold enough so that it doesn't thaw, because the permafrost contains methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And if we lost the permafrost of the world, we would be releasing 4 times more carbon than humanity has burned since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we know we have to keep our Arctic cold enough. Yes, as Sheila Watt-Cloutier told us years ago, to protect human rights of the Inuit peoples, we must keep the Arctic cold. To protect traditional hunting and culture. But we also, for the sake of all of the species on this planet, we need to keep the Arctic cold, to keep that methane in the permafrost and keep it from thawing. There are some really significant drivers here. Let's think about what we do creatively. In the immediate short term, we need more resources to British Columbia. We need to help rebuild key roads and railroads so that supply chains are protected, that the economy recovers. We need to help individual farmers and homeowners who didn't have insurance. We need to find a way to help families rebuild their lives on a very personal level. We have to think about rebuilding, retooling, and adapting to the climate emergency that we now experience. And I think we have to think creatively about things that we don't often think about. In this emergency, we needed volunteers jumping into their boats and rescuing people. It's not comfortable for governments to think, well, those are uninsured people. Is that really a good idea? We really don't want... If the people of Abbotsford and Merritt hadn't shown up and sandbagged key infrastructure, the situation would have been much worse. How do we think creatively about climate adaptation corps to respond in emergencies and create resilient communities where people are deputized to go out and save lives? A major event happened in my community over Christmas 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, where it was off the charts crazy weather, climate-induced, and large trees were blown down across the roads, and it was Christmas, and everybody lost electricity. This happens in major weather events. You lose your landline, you lose your cell coverage, and you can't move around, in this case because trees were across the road. So people in my community, a lot of smart people, they know that it's illegal to go out when the power's out because trees are down. It's illegal to go out with chainsaws and cut up the trees and go help your neighbors. Everybody did it. They took care of each other through Christmas. Somebody who's living on their own in their 90s, they're not going to leave them there because it's illegal to cut trees off the road. We need to figure this out. How do we empower people who know how to react in an emergency and create trained, legal, appropriate responses that engage our volunteers? Because community members in these communities, and I know the honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola, will agree with me that there were great acts of bravery through the communities, individuals acting, and we need to harness that. Bottom line, Mr. Speaker, we are looking at climate emergencies that have killed hundreds of people in the last number of months in British Columbia, nearly 600 in the heat dome, more now through the floods. And what we need to think about is global average temperature is now 1.1 degrees Celsius above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. We're trying to see if we can hang on to 1.5 degrees. 1.5 is not a safe zone. It's going to be worse than what it's like right now at 1.1. But il y a rien plus important.
But there is nothing more important than protecting our young people, our children, our grandchildren, because this is a threat.
To do yet. We still do not act on a day-to-day basis as though we understand we're in a climate emergency. I would urge the government, since we've already bought Trans Mountain and we have all those workers and all that equipment, let's just change the mandate of that Crown Corporation and put those people and that equipment to work to rebuild, to repair our highways, to help protect them against the next major climate event. We know from the last 24 hours on Cape Breton Island, where I'm from, we see roads washed out there, we see roads washed out near Corner Brook, Newfoundland, Labrador. There's no one part of this country that is safe and secure any more than there's one place on this planet safe and secure in the climate emergency. We have to all pull together, and as the speech from the throne said, le temps est venu d'aller plus.
It's time to go further, faster.
We don't see in the speech from the throne the things we must do, but we know what they are, and tonight is a good opportunity to put forward those good ideas and together say, we work for our communities, we work for Canada, and we will save the planet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it is important, and I want to pick up on what the member just made reference to, and that is pulling together. And I think that one of the things that, as we look at what's taking place in the province of British Columbia, is that we recognize that it's not only the national government, it's also the provincial government, municipalities, and many other stakeholders. We all have an interest in making sure that BC and the people that are so dramatically affected are in fact lifted out of this, and we help build back. And I'm wondering if the member can just provide her thoughts in regards to just how important it is that the different levels of government continue to show that sympathy and to provide the support that's so critically important to help these communities in need.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
It's critically important. It's going to have a big price tag. And I was struck when the Honourable Prime Minister spoke in Glasgow, the reference to Lytton. But Lytton is still there, and it needs to be rebuilt. The people of Lytton are there, and it's a major First Nations community as well, with scattered First Nations that live around it. It's important that we leave no community behind in this, but it's not going to be inexpensive. For decades, studies have shown that the costs of ignoring climate change were going to be far larger than the costs of action. So now we find ourselves in the unenviable position where we need to do both harder and faster. Fortunately, rebuilding communities does stimulate the economy. Fortunately, getting all the people that possibly can get to work to help farms rebuild. I mean, there's been so much loss and devastating loss that it's hard to imagine how some families will pull everything together. But they need to know that there's going to be a source of funds to get their farm back up and running. They need to know that their home can be repaired, even if the insurance companies say you're not covered for this kind of flood. There's going to have to be a rethink of how we respond to what used to be called natural disasters, which are no longer natural.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Smilkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly want to salute my fellow British Columbian for her comments today and her sympathy for all those that have been affected by the flooding in our great province. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member talked about needing to do things differently. And so tonight I know we're going to debate lots of different ideas, and I do hope we hit some big ideas. For example, I've heard from small municipalities that the DFA, the Disaster Finance Assistance Program, they can't afford the 20% that they're expected, while senior levels of government are expected to do 80%. So what does she think about that? And second, she did talk about empowering communities. Now, the last time the federal government arranged with the province of British Columbia in the gas tax agreement of 2014, but I think there's an area that we can improve upon. Tim Roberts, who's an area director for rural Karameas, has suggested that small regional districts and municipalities should be able to use some of their leftover gas tax so that they can use it towards flood mitigation, fire mitigation, Mr. Speaker, because many times there's interface area where there's fuel that can easily be removed if they were to hire students over the summer to do so. So could the member comment on some of the big ideas, but also some of these small ideas that are so important to help our communities adapt to climate change?
Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And in the same spirit of working across party lines, I want to salute the Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Smilkameen Nicola, for attending COP26, not just for a couple of days, but for the full 2 weeks. And I saw his comments in the media recently that the nature-based solutions that were talked about at COP are really important. I would suggest, too, that students in the summer planting trees, restoring, what I referred to as hydrophobic soil. The hill that was burnt off, was it 2017, the Elephant Hill fire? Nothing's growing back, right? Because the soil, it just became baked. And the top surface was destroyed by the heat of the fire. We need to get trees into, and not just any trees, trees that are right to that ecosystem. That'll help restore our salmon. That'll help bring things back. And those jobs and that ecosystem is a key part also of responding to the climate emergency. I just say that to his point about small communities, absolutely. They don't have the money to come up with 20%. We need to be much more creative of how we're going to help particularly small, impoverished, rural and remote communities cope with an increased, and I'm afraid to say inevitable, level of extreme weather events that wipe out their infrastructure. We need to be really creative.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires, honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands. She knows how much I appreciate her, and every time I have the opportunity to tell her, I tell her, so I'll tell her once again today. Thank you. And you'll give me a few moments, because this is the first time I've spoken in the 44th Parliament, to thank the people of Lac-Saint-Jean who put their confidence in me again. And all of my constituents took part in the election process, and I want to thank my partner of 24 years, Mylène Coutier. And I would say now that it's horrible to see what's happening in British Columbia. We know that this is one of the consequences of climate change. You'd have to be blind not to admit that simple fact. Today, the Prime Minister, during question period, said suddenly that he had understood what was a provincial jurisdiction and a federal jurisdiction, and he said that he could not intervene in Alberta with the gas and oil industry because of provincial jurisdiction. My question is the following one. Is this not a contradiction when this government that had promised that it would cancel subsidies to the fossil fuel industry increased them over the last few years? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. Thank you, and I thank my colleague from Lac-Saint-Jean, and congratulations to him. When he talks about his family, I think of his father. And his family. So it's clear that we have problems here in Canada, and that we must act when needed. It is difficult. I do know that. It's difficult for the federal government to have a good relationship with Alberta, for example. But I think at one time, for example, during the acid rain campaign, or to stop chemicals from hurting the ozone layer. Here we have done great things to protect the lives on this planet, but it's never possible without a great deal of courage, very great moral and political courage to do that.
Comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay. Question of about a minute, and hopefully a minute answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands for her speech. And she talked about the tragedy of losing more than 500 people in the heat dome. Most of these people were low-income people living in urban heat islands in apartments without air conditioning. The federal government could come up with a program, the funding, to switch those natural gas furnaces in those buildings to clean heat pumps that could cool those buildings as well as heat them, so we could save hundreds of lives across this country and reduce emissions as well. And I'm hoping that this is, one of these ideas that we have to come up with in this era of adaptation.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, and thanks to my honourable colleague from South Okanagan, West Kootenay. I'm very concerned that well, of course, the impacts of the climate crisis are understood to be intersectional, and whether we're looking globally to developing countries or within Canada, it's the poor, it's Indigenous, it's people of color who are most often victims of climate events. In the case of the heat dome, I was horrified that Premier John Horgan said we had no way of knowing. We just thought it was going to be hotter weather. I was horrified that both the federal and provincial governments, British Columbia and Canada, continue to increase fossil fuel subsidies at the very moment they should be cut. But I totally agree, there's things we could do. They include things like shade, more urban forests, more opportunities to let people go into parks. It was horrifying to me that Vancouver officials didn't want people going into the Strathcona Park area for fear they would set up tents again, but that was life-giving shade. We need more attention to how we survive, more attention to cooling centers, more attention to social networks of resilience that get people out of their homes into safe, cool locations where they're given water, where they have access to ice. It's saving lives that counts on a minute-to-minute basis, and we need to be much better prepared.